Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our afternoon presentation, which is Research Talks. My name is Amir Fuad, and I'm Mobilizing Justice Research Coordinator. So, as Steve already mentioned, we have three back-to-back sessions that feature working papers that explore transport poverty from different angles and using data from Mobilizing Justice National Survey on Transport Poverty. So together, this presentation highlights a wide range of emerging research on accessibility, mobility disadvantages, travel behavior, and equity in transportation planning across Canada. So before we begin our presentations, just a quick note for presenters. Each presentation is scheduled for 15 minutes and will be followed by a short Q&A a discussion. So I kindly ask all presenters to keep within the time limit so we can stay on the schedule and allow time for discussion. So with that, let's begin session one, which is suppressed travel and accessibility. Generally, this session brings together research examining how transportation barriers shape people's daily lives, well-beings, and opportunities across Canada. And so we will hear perspective on suppressed travel and accessibility in relation to transport poverty. So our first presentation is Do Perceptions Influence Suppressed and Access Travel, a structural equation modeling approach by Paromita Nakshi from University of Toronto. So Paromita, please share your screen and go ahead.
Thank you so much, Amir. I hope you all can see my screen. If not, please just let me know in the comments. But so this is a part of a bigger work as part of my doctoral research at the University of Toronto. But because we have limited time today, I wanted to have a more focused presentation and discussion. So I want to just present the suppressed travel model in this presentation. Um, so, oops, okay. So I want to start from the idea that suppressed travel is an indicator of transport-related social exclusion. And why is that? Because suppressed travel reflects situation where, for whatever reason, maybe for affordability reasons, safety reasons, limited access reasons, people want to travel, but they cannot travel as much as they would like to or as much as they would need to. And as a result, this leads to an involuntary exclusion from out of home activities and can lead to reduced activity participation and social exclusion for people. So, in this research, the central question that I want to address is how do people's perception of accessibility, along with calculated accessibility, perception of safety, and affordability influence their perception of suppressed travel? Because this question really gets at the heart of how perceptions translate into lived mobility inequalities. So, existing research suggests that cognitive environment play an important role in attitudes and behaviors, such as mode choice, ridership, usage of facilities, and even whether to travel or not. And at the same time, researchers have found that individual socio-demographic characteristics, skills, if affect our emotions, habits, and social norms, all these are actually key influencing factors in the process through which we develop our cognitive environment. So, for example, for people with disabilities or parents pushing strollers, broken elevators or crowding in the metro can undermine even universally accessible infrastructure or transit and can shape their perceptions and usage. At the same time, research have also found that perceptive factors may even play a bigger role than calculated measures. That's because quantitative and map-based measures often tend to overestimate accessibility and underestimate inequality, because often assume that everyone experiences the transportation system in the same way. Whereas in reality, perceptions of safety, affordability, and accessibility can differ sharply across social groups. So, for example, we all know that safety is experienced very differently by women and racialized travelers, while affordability can depend on not just household income, but also on household circumstances, composition, trip patterns, different travel needs. And at the same time, when people already travel less than they would like to, what we call suppressed demand or unmet travel needs, conventional affordability measures can be misleading because people are spending less, but not because they are willingly spending less. Maybe they're spending less because they just don't have enough money to spend on transportation and essentially missing out from activity participation. So, understanding these differences means recognizing that people's cognitive environment, their perceptions, and mental models are distinct from physical environment and shaped by socioeconomic factors, demographic identities, skills, abilities, all these factors. So, appreciating this distinction has important scholarly implications as well as policy implications. Why? Because it challenges us to look beyond just infrastructure and costs and to consider how people actually experience their infrastructure, transportation system, and accessibility when we design interventions aimed at improving transport equity and justice. So against that backdrop, I use this framework in this research to conceptualize how different distinct perceptual constructs are related to each other, and at the same time, how calculated accessibility and individual and household level variables such as income, car ownership, socio-demographic characteristics affect these perceptions. So for this research, I used, of course, a national survey of transport poverty in Canada, as well as Statistics Canada's special access measures. And this study was done in the context of Chrono CMA. I developed a model for suppressed travel using confirmatory factor analysis and structural equation modeling to really understand both the direct effects as well as some mechanisms or pathways through highlighting the indirect effects as well. And the model showed excellent goodness of fit. So this table shows the indicators and the corresponding survey questions from the national survey that I used to develop the latent variables of perceived mobility, perceived accessibility, and safety. And many of you are aware of the scale that has been used in this survey. So it's a just about right scale where basically on a scale of 1 to 100, 50 indicates exactly the desired level, the ideal level. And scores below 50 can indicate suppression or inadequacy for perceived travel or perceived accessibility, whereas scores above 50 indicates there is an excessive of whatever that indicator variable is. The perceived safety is like a scale of 1 to 100. So part of the models with key results are shown in this table, but I really want to focus on the main implications of the findings, which really drive home the central role of perception. So first, perceived safety and suppressed travel. So the model shows that safety does not directly influence whether people suppress travel or travel less than they would like to. However, it works indirectly through perceptions of accessibility. So what does that mean? It means that when people feel safer, they also find their environment to be more accessible. And that perception of better accessibility is what drives reduced perceptions of suppressed travel. And the total effect is non-significant because influence of direct and indirect travels operate in different directions and entirely through the mediated pathway of the indirect effect. But as we can see that the indirect effect is significant, so that means perceived safety influences perceived suppressed access and consequently suppressed travel. Next, perceived affordability and suppressed travel. So in this case, people sense that transport is unaffordable doesn't directly change how much they suppress travel. So very similar to what we have seen before with perceived safety. Instead, affordability shapes how people perceive their system in terms of how accessible it is. So when people perceive transport to be less affordable, they also feel that it's less accessible. And that perception in turn leads them to suppress their travel more. So once again, the direct path is not significant, but the mediated path through perceived accessibility is significant, and showing that affordability affects travel behavior indirectly through perceived accessibility. Next, perceived accessibility and suppressed travel. So this is quite intuitive because it shows that perceived suppressed accessibility has a direct and strong effect on suppressed travel. So if people feel that, uh, if people perceive their accessibility to be suppressed, they also tend to suppress their travel and tend to travel less. And finally, calculated accessibility or spatial accessibility from Statistics Canada's spatial access measures, which for this case I use the peak hour transit access to work measures. So with the calculated accessibility, when we finally look at this, we see the same mediated pattern as with safety and affordability. So the direct effect on suppressed travel is not significant, but the indirect effect through perceived accessibility is significant and negative. So it means the higher the calculated accessibility is, uh, people, in that case, people tend to suppress their travel less. And this is because it improves how accessible people experience their environment to be. So once again, the take-home message is perceptions of accessibility actually serve as the bridge between the infrastructure we have and people's behavioral outcomes. Now, to summarize the key findings, first, perceived accessibility had a much stronger influence on suppressed travel than calculated accessibility measures in the model, which is approximately 8 times larger. So once again, how accessible people feel is far more predictive of whether they suppress travel than what our models say about calculated accessibility. The next is calculated accessibility, safety, and affordability affected suppressed travel only indirectly and through their influence on perceived accessibility latent variable. So this means travel behavior is shaped more by experiential accessibility than by calculated accessibility. It also highlights the point that understanding the mechanisms or pathways and the indirect effect is important because without modeling the indirect effects, it's possible that the pathways won't be very clear, or in cases where the total effects are not significant or not really large, the model might incorrectly estimate the effects to be very small or not significant, even though when the indirect effect is actually very meaningful and can have important policy and planning implications. And finally, although I didn't show it in the slides just to not overcrowd the slide much, but the model showed that socio-demographic variables such as gender, low income, disability significantly affected perceptions. So what does this findings mean for transportation policy and planning? So first, these findings really shaped how we think about accessibility and policy because they remind us that perceptions are key policy levers. So it's not enough to simply improve service coverage or reduce travel times alone, because people need to experience that the environment is accessible. That means addressing reliability issues, providing up-to-date and correct information about, for example, transit arrival, making sure the information is accessible, that the design of our public infrastructure, walking and cycling environment is actually safe and has a functional universal design, and that it is convenient and comfortable. All these can play a key role in ensuring that people can experience this improvement in accessibility. And this has important implications from a planning perspective in the way that there has been a lot of discussion about the reliability and travel time of East-West LRT, discussions around streetcar reliability, and all these can actually play a key role. All these actually um, brings down to that point that it is just not important, just not enough to improve coverage or show accessibility improvement on the map, but to take into account the whole experience. And the next thing that is very important from both research as well as planning perspective is we need to measure accessibility differently. So it doesn't mean that calculated accessibility is not useful. Rather, it's very useful, very important. But our metrics should actually combine calculated and perceptual dimensions to reflect the lived experiences of people, which is specifically important for equity deserving population groups. And finally, accessibility and equity. So the gaps between calculated and perceived accessibility actually reveal something deeper, which is the hidden inequalities in access and participations. So two neighborhoods might actually have identical modeled accessibility or calculated accessibility. But if one group feels unsafe, uninformed, or priced out, their experiential accessibility or functional accessibility can be much lower. So those perceptual disparities are where inequity lives, and more work is needed in that field. Um, so that was it from my end. I'm happy to answer any question you might have. So yeah, thank you so much for listening today.
Thanks so much, Paramita, for your presentation. So we now have time for a couple of questions before moving to next presentation. So feel free to either raise your hand or post your question in the chat box. I can see I have already a question in the chat box from Megan.
Um, yeah, so I see Professor Megan Winter's question. This is an important question, and I think a lot of work is needed in that area. So I do not have a concise set of questions that I can readily recommend, but what I can say is that there's a lot of questions that we can see in the national survey that can be useful. I also want to extend these discussions because there are actually a lot of other parallel studies have already been published. For example, transport adequacy scales and perceived accessibility scale. So there's actually a lot of scale. What I think is kind of more challenging is um, developing some sort of uniform scale that anyone can use and that can be comparable across different geographies, which you often see in public health research where they have very standardized indicators. So I think that is something where more research is needed. So sort of like actually validating existing scales, see how they are connected to mobility outcomes. That can be some interesting avenue for future research, if that makes sense. But I think that's a great question.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, I think I have a question for you. So do you think, based on your paper, do you think there could be some expectation bias in this work? For example, individual living at disadvantages situations, underestimating their like challenges and responding somewhat positively because they are used to the challenge or find a way to cope with it? And if yes, how do you think that might affect your findings?
Yeah, a great question. I think perceptions can, of course, because they are influenced by people's experiences and expectations, there are, of course, some chances that the responses are have some kind of expectation bias in that. However, the important takeaway from this model is that even these estimates are actually conservative estimates in a way that even if we assume people in disadvantaged conditions actually perceived things to be better than they are in terms of like objectively better, um, there is still very significant relationships and large relationships showing that perceptions are actually influencing people's mobility outcomes. So my argument would be that without those type of expectations bias, the effects will actually be bigger, and the magnitude would be bigger, and the direction would actually be in the same direction. So any improvement, let's say in reliability or safety, is likely to have bigger effect on people than what the models show, which is, I think, is a good thing.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.